Welcome to the TŌV Podcast. My name's Levi Hazen. I have the privilege of being your host for today, as well as serving as the Executive Director of Life in Messiah International. For over 135 years, Life in Messiah has sought to bring the good news to Jewish communities around the globe, as well as help Christians understand the Jewish roots of our faith. You can learn more about the work that God's doing through our staff by visiting us on the web at lifeinmessiah.org. I'm very excited today because my friend Jacob Gluck is here with us in studio. Jacob, welcome to the TŌV Podcast.
Thank you, Levi, for that presentation. It's an honor for me to be here. I appreciate the hospitality, and I look forward to having this conversation with you today.
Yeah, well, congratulations are in order because you just published a book. Tell us more about this book. I'm excited to dive into it, and I think our listeners and viewers might as well.
Yeah, and I'm super excited about this book because it did take me a long time to write this, 7 years to be exact.
Wow.
And so the book basically covers Haredi culture in general and the Satmar Hasidic sect in particular in the modern present form. So there have been books in the past describing the culture from the 1950s, 60s, immediately after the war, but there hasn't been anything in recent years.
Interesting.
Especially from the point of view and the experience of somebody who lived it.
And you lived it.
Correct. Somebody who grew up from within the community. So I did grow up in Borough Park in the 80s, 90s. And so that's a perspective that hasn't been offered until
so
now.
far, yeah. So what makes you an insider is the fact that you lived this lifestyle for how long and where exactly and what did that look like?
Yeah, so like I said, I grew up in Borough Park. I grew up in Satmar, which is the dominant Hasidic sect in America.
Satmar.
Yeah, Satmar.
Okay.
So it is the dominant Hasidic sect in America. It has its roots in Hungary before the war. And, after the Holocaust, when all of Judaism was basically destroyed in Europe, so they decided pretty much, within a few years after the Holocaust that they were not going to rebuild there. And so they basically relocated and they established themselves in Williamsburg. Okay. Which is the place where all Jewish immigrants came over the years. That has a legacy, a history of all the Jewish immigrants settling in Williamsburg. And so Satmar established itself in Williamsburg, and basically all the other Hungarian-affiliated Hasidic sects kind of became satellites, so to speak, of Satmar. They kind of gravitated towards that type of ethos, and they were inspired by Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, who was the leader of the movement after the war.
Interesting. What I'd like to do eventually here is get into a little bit of the practices and the beliefs of the Hasidic community and so forth. But before that happens, you touched briefly on the history of the community in the United States of America. Let's revisit that a second. When you mentioned after the war, is that when the community really started here in the U.S.? Was it before that? And the Satmar community in particular, what's the history there?
Yeah, so Satmar is the name of a town in Hungary. So to describe Satmar in particular would take us back to Europe before the war. So it originally was not a Hasidic town. So what we call it Ashkenazic, which means that it's European, but it's not Hasidic. Okay. So in the 1930s, the town started to gravitate towards Hasidism, and it appointed Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, who was a Hasidic rabbi, as its leader. And so the town basically converted to the movement, so to speak.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, but I should note, however, that the Hasidic movement in Hungary took a different turn and had a different flavor than it had in Poland, Ukraine. It originated in Ukraine, of course, but as it moved from Poland, Ukraine, Galicia, and then into Hungary, it kind of evolved and matured in a way. And so the Hungarian version was a more rational form, slightly less emphasis on dancing and spirituality and that kind of thing, and more emphasis on Torah study. So that's an important distinction to make, and I do elaborate on this in the book that I've just published. Okay,
you talk a little bit about the history
Absolutely.
in the book.
Yeah, I should note that I do emphasize the history of practices. So I don't just present as it is right now, but I also like readers to know how it evolved over the years. So I felt that was a very important, characteristic that readers would want to know, not just simply stating this is how it is, but also how it came to be this way.
Sure. Yeah. A lot of times that's what we're wondering is how did this group of people come to believe this or do this certain custom? Let's talk a little bit about the attire, because clearly if you're in Brooklyn and you're in a place like Williamsburg or Borough Park or somewhere like that, you see a lot of our Jewish friends wearing the religious garb. Mm-hmm. And certainly that used to be you for 19 years of your life.
It did, yeah.
So tell us about the religious garb that we see. What kind of meanings are behind it and why? What's the purpose of it?
Very good question. So to introduce the answer, I want to emphasize the fact that part of what Haredi movement offers is distinction in all our attributes, in all the attributes of the Jewish community. So we want to distinguish ourselves from our host country and from the host culture. And so you can do this through language. The Satmar community in which I grew up, they speak Yiddish natively. And, their English is not very, very good.
Yeah, and for those who may not be familiar, tell me a little bit about Yiddish in terms of its flavors, right? Is it Hebrew mainly? Is it German mainly? Is it something else? What is Yiddish for our listeners who may not know?
Yeah, Yiddish is derived from German.
Okay.
But it also has Slavic words and Hebrew words thrown into the mix.
Okay.
So it's a kind of a hybrid language. But mostly it's Germanic with, of course, the Jewish dialect of it. Right? So it's not, after many decades and centuries of speaking a language within a particular group, it evolves in its own form. So it's different, yeah.
Interesting. So if I was born into a Satmar Jewish family, would Yiddish be my first language?
Yes.
Okay.
Yiddish would be your first language, especially in the community that I focus on in my book, which is Williamsburg. So there are differences. In other neighborhoods, English has a little bit more currency than it does in Williamsburg, because Williamsburg is the core.
Yeah, the epicenter.
Right? Yeah, exactly, the epicenter. So if you go to Borough Park, where I grew up actually, and I cover this in my book in more detail, my sisters spoke a more fluent English than I did. Because among girls, they're exposed to a greater secular education than boys are.
Okay.
And for whatever reason, that's just how things evolved, especially in Borough Park. But if you go to Williamsburg girls, those who are educated in the Satmar schools, they do, in fact, speak Yiddish to one another.
Okay, interesting. So the language to me is fascinating. And
I just want to go back to, you asked me about the attire.
That's what I want to get back to, is the attire. Very good. Right. So let's start with from the head to the toe. Mm-hmm. Let's start with the kippah or the hat or whatever it might be. Can you tell us more about what we're seeing there and why?
Let me just finish the thought that I was trying to finish earlier, which is that the emphasis is on being different.
Okay.
Because that's the important thing. That our attire should be ethnically distinguishable from the others. Because we don't want, that was Rabbi Teitelbaum's thing, that he did not want us to mix and be influenced and acculturated, like adopt the mainstream/host culture.
Yeah.
And so the important thing is preserve your attire, not because there's something inherently important in that attire, but rather because it's different. So you're not adopting your host, you're not losing your traditional values.
And
that's the most important thing. Regardless of what exactly you're wearing, that's not important, but it's different.
So does that come like from the Torah though, about how you're supposed to be set apart from all the peoples and everything? Or is that just something?
It does. It's inspired by the Torah.
Okay.
There are commandments in the Torah to distinguish ourselves from, do not be like the nations that I am actually expelling before you, referring to the Canaanites. So yes, there is reference to this in the Tanakh, in the Bible, but the specifics are, obviously are not there. And the main motive for this is to preserve the essence of Haredism, which is non-acculturation.
Okay.
Do not become lost within your host
Don't
culture.
assimilate.
Don't assimilate, correct.
Okay, stand out, be together, makes sense.
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about some specifics of the attire now. So clearly, the community has decided on a particular way to stand out and not assimilate. But I believe a lot of the clothing that's worn and so forth has some meaning behind it.
Yes, sure.
So let's start with the top of the head.
Yeah. So there is head coverings are first mentioned in the Talmud. There is a reference there that some Amora is the term referring to a interpreter / speaker, in the Talmudic era. So he would elaborate and explicate the Mishnaic teachings. But anyway, so there is a reference there that an Amora said that you should cover your hair so that the fear of God should be on you.
Okay.
Be upon you. And then there is anecdotal things that, this and this Amora did not go more than 4 cubits without covering his head.
Okay.
Things of that nature. So this is how it all became inspired. Now, to a certain extent, in Europe before the war, everyone had head coverings. Not necessarily the yarmulke, but they had what's called a kasketel. Have you heard of that? Kasketel?
I've never heard that word, yeah.
In Poland, that was very popular. But it was pretty common throughout the culture, not necessarily within the Jewish culture in particular. But the Jews made an emphasis of wearing head covering at all times, especially in the synagogue. So it's interesting to note that among Christians, my understanding is that when you walk into a church,
you take
it off, right? Whereas in Judaism, it's just the opposite. So even if you're not covering your head outside, which you're supposed to, of course, but definitely put it on when you enter the synagogue. And Reform-minded Jews are like that. Conservative Reform, they don't wear head coverings when they're outside, but when they enter the synagogue, they do.
And again, the main purpose is a reverence for God. I think that's important for people to understand.
That's according to the Talmud, yes.
And that's according to the Talmud. And that's for either the black hat that we might see, or a baseball cap, or even a kippah.
Yeah, so when it comes to hats in particular, the black hats, a lot of it also is just traditional. Because if you go back and you look at pictures of America, for example, 100 years ago, everyone wore hats.
That's true.
You know what I'm saying?
True, yeah.
So to a certain extent, it's just preserving tradition and non-assimilation. So even if it's not distinctively Jewish in origin, because they're not, the hats are not distinctively Jewish in origin, including the shtreimel, for example. So the shtreimel is presumed to have been worn by the Russian the upper classes, those who could afford it. It was made out of fur, of course.
And for those who may not know what a shtreimel is, what is that?
It's just a round disc with fur that covers your head. Yeah. And in cold climates, you needed it as a functional element of your clothing, right? But in modern day America, it took on a whole meaning of its own, and it has evolved literally over the last 10, 15 years, and it became a lot thicker than originally. Like my dad's shtreimel was like this, when I knew him in the 80s, and now it's like double the size, literally.
I've seen even bigger than that, depending on the sect, and it's my understanding these hats cost thousands of dollars sometimes.
Correct. Very expensive.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And it's a whole art making them, and procuring the material to make that, because the fur doesn't come from America, and so it's an art, it's a craft making them, and they're very expensive, as you said, right?
So, okay, let's move on from the hat, and let's talk about the payas.
So there is a verse in the Torah, I believe it's in Leviticus, Lo takifu pa'as roshchem, do not round the edges of your head. That is the verse that the custom is derived from. Now, exactly what that verse means is debatable. It's not necessarily, probably doesn't actually refer to what the Hasidim do nowadays. But like I said earlier, the most important thing here is distinction.
Sure.
And this is something, if I had a conversation with Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum right now, he would readily admit it. Like, we don't even care what this verse really means to say. What we care about is that you look different from others, and as a result, you do not socially mix with them. This was an important thing, because if you socialize with non-Jews, or even with Jews who are not of the same religious persuasion, the religious rigor as you, then you will learn from them, and your own religious observance will attenuate.
Wow, so fascinating. So you go from the hat to the payas, which for those who may not be familiar, the payot or the payas are what we might describe as the side curls that we often see coming down the face of particularly men. But then beyond that, you have a lot of black color in the apparel. So we have black coats oftentimes, black pants. Why is this the case?
My understanding is that it's just traditional. I think this is what peasants or whatever wore in Europe before the war. And like I said, we want to preserve tradition as much as possible, because that's our guide, that's our heritage, and that's how we preserve our religion, because religion is itself traditional, right? It's itself what our ancestors practiced many centuries ago. So that's part of the package, is preserving our religion and preserving our attire. And that's my understanding. I may be missing something, perhaps, but especially, in general, I would say that in Europe, the general attire of people was drab, like not very colorful.
Not very colorful, yeah.
Right.
Okay, so let's say we're doing a walking tour of Brooklyn, New York today. As we walk through these different communities, we will also see that people are dressed differently, and yet they're all kind of classified as religious. So I've heard that the different sects within Rabbinic Judaism also have different styles of dress and different things that they do. What can we learn about the different sects regarding the attire, and are there any interesting ones that you think we should know about?
Yeah, there are differences between the sects. In the book, I try to focus mostly on the Satmars, but I do mention in passing how others dress as well. The differences stem from where they came from Europe. So if their host culture dressed in a particular way, like we mentioned the shtreimel, for example. So it comes from Russia, because Hasidism started in Russia. And once Hasidism adopted the shtreimel, as Hasidism migrated out of Ukraine and it basically radiated out into other regions, it took the shtreimel with it. And so this is how it diffused into the mainstream. But by the way, it started out only the tzaddikim, meaning the Hasidic leaders, wore the shtreimel. And over the years, the followers and adherents, they also started doing it. And nowadays, everyone wears it.
Everyone wears it. Yeah, interesting.
But back to your question, what was your question again? The differences. Right. The differences between the sects. So the Satmars wear what's called a stuff hat. In Yiddish, a stoffenhit. You like that?
I like that word.
Stuff is actually the material, felt.
Huh.
It's a synonym for felt, I believe.
Okay.
But anyway, so it used to be made out of literally of stuff, whatever that means, okay? And so the Satmars wear the stuff hat. There's also what's called the platschige beaverhit, which is, in English, a flat beaver hat.
Okay.
So it's no longer made of beaver fur. I highly doubt it, but that's what it's called. So those are the two type of hats that the Satmars wear. The flat beaver hat is distinctive to Satmar. No other, I should say, non-Hungarian sect wears it.
Interesting.
So there are other Hungarian, like small Hasidic sects that also wear that, but for Bells, Vizhnitz, those do not do that. Those do what's called the deep beaver hat.
Huh.
Okay, so that's higher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So the beaver hat is considered more aesthetic than especially the stuff hat, but also even the flat beaver hat is considered kind of like just bad form or bad fashion. And so it's actually, over the years, it's actually getting higher.
Wow.
We talked about the evolution of the shtreimel.
Yeah.
So the beaver hat is also evolving.
Oh, interesting.
It's now taller than it used to be.
That's fascinating. One element we haven't talked about yet, and I know that I receive some questions about the tzitzit. The tzitzit, for those who may not be familiar with that term, are what we might call the tassels or the fringes on the side that we oftentimes see Jewish men wear. Right. We even see references to this in the New Testament. It appears that Yeshua even wore tzitzit when he lived in the first century, or at least he had fringes on his garment that a woman came up and touched.
Right.
What's the importance of the tzitzit, and what happens with these?
Yeah, so my view on this is actually different from the mainstream view within Judaism.
Okay.
I believe that the practice originated with the priests in the temple. So they used to the psil techeles is a blue thread. So there was some type of signification of that in the priestly uniform. So the type of hat that they wore, I don't know the specifics. It's hard to recreate this, exactly how they wore it and what the signification of this was. But I believe that originally the tassels / fringes were meant to signify that a Jew who wears it is associated with holiness, namely somehow affiliated with the priestly class. Even though you're not a priest, but the Torah wants us to be holy just like the priests.
Sure.
So we want to emulate the priests, and since the priests wear the psil techeles, the blue thread, therefore we should somehow put a blue thread on the corners of our garments as well.
Okay.
So that's my take on it.
Mm-hmm. And so this is why every religious Jewish male that we see is wearing the tzitzit. Does that start at a certain age?
Correct, and I should point out that the blue thread is completely obsolete.
Oh, no.
Completely obsolete.
I figured maybe they had one
hold on
in
a second.
there. Yeah.
I shouldn't say it's completely obsolete. It's obsolete among Satmars. Now, the Breslava, they do that. And especially in Israel, there's a lot of more, there's many more people, or I should say, persuasions, sects, whatever you want to call them, who actually do try to, adopt that.
Adapt that. Okay. Right. And is that from the earliest age that you can start wearing clothing, or is there a certain age that people start wearing tzitzit?
So the custom of chinuch is basically training. So the custom among modern day Hasidim / Charedim is to start chinuch, training of our young ones at the age of 3. So we are not obligated to do this until the age of 13 for males, but we start the training process at age 3. So that's the earliest age where a toddler / young boy would wear tzitzit. Yeah.
Okay.
And there's a ceremony for that.
Yeah, there's a ceremony for that. This may be a conversation more prone to the next section, but I just want to get into it now before we go to a break here. When it comes to the amount of prayers that a typical religious Jewish guy is saying, how many times a day is that? And are those prayers written down? And do different sects have different prayers? What does that look like?
No, different sects do not have different prayers.
Okay.
The prayer is very uniform, very standardized. It's part of part of the Haredi movement is to standardize everything and ossify everything. It cannot change. And so the variations in prayer is highly discouraged. In fact, according to the Talmud, tefillah b'chal lashon, which means we want you to pray in any language that you are comfortable in, because we want the prayer to be heartfelt.
Sure.
But that's not how things are. So it's always the ideal, what the Talmud says it should be, and how it is in fact. And so the fact of the matter is nobody prays in Yiddish. Well, there are some women prayer in Yiddish, but no male would ever pray in Yiddish.
They're playing in Hebrew.
In Hebrew, always in Hebrew. And it's, if you ask me, I would say the prayer is less sincere if you do it that way, because it's not a vernacular. It's not a natural language.
Unless you're in Israel.
But
then you're speaking modern Hebrew and not biblical Hebrew.
Correct. Yeah.
Interesting.
Right.
So how many times a day is that? Is there a required amount per day?
So the required amount, the absolute minimum amount is 2. So there's shacharit, which is the morning prayer, and there's mincha, which is the afternoon prayer.
Okay.
Now there is an additional prayer, ma'ariv or aravit, which is performed in the evening, but that, according to the Talmud, it is voluntary. Now it has been accepted as obligatory, but technically speaking, it is voluntary, and those who are knowledgeable tend to be a little more lax with it. Of course, it's a secret. You're not supposed to. The scholars are not going to tell the masses, "Hey, you know."
Interesting.
Right. Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about clothing. We've talked a little bit about beliefs and customs. Let's talk about one of the most important parts of a culture, and that's the food. Mm-hmm. Is there anything particular with the Satmar community relating to food?
Okay.
Or maybe just the Hasidic community? Or
I'm not that much of a foodie, so I wouldn't necessarily know that many details, but the Satmars have adopted Hungarian food in general.
Okay.
Magyar. Magyar means Hungarian. So chalapces, for example. Have you heard of that? Chalapces?
No.
So those are ground minced meat and wrapped up in cabbage.
Okay.
With spices and other seasoning as well. So that's just one of the distinctive Hungarian food types. But of course, the requirement of the Jewish diet is what defines the Haredi and the Hasidic food in general, which is you cannot mix milk and meat, and obviously all the forbidden types of foods, such as pork, seafood, and all of that stuff.
Right.
Yeah, but a lot of the distinctive diet is from the host culture.
From the host culture.
Correct. So whatever Hungarians did before the war, that has carried over into America after the war.
Okay.
And we don't know how long this is going to last, because we're still relatively recent after the Holocaust.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
Yeah, so it's very possible that in a few decades from now, a lot of these things, actually, there is a thing called borscht. Have you heard of that, borscht?
Borscht. I've had borscht before. Yeah.
So that's something that literally, within the last 20, 30 years, it has declined in popularity.
Huh.
Because a lot of people don't like it because it's fermented.
It's good though.
Yeah, I know. It's actually very healthy.
Yeah. It's
because it has
the
the good bacteria.
Yeah.
But people don't like it, and it becomes less and less popular. The woman of the house, she makes it for the whole family. By the way, on Passover, there's a lot of guests, so she can make like a big, huge batch of it, and many of them don't want it. So the next year she's making less and less and less, and then 1 year she doesn't make any borscht because nobody, no takers.
Yeah, sure. Interesting. Well, very good. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation thus far. I look forward to continuing it. We're going to take a quick break on the TŌV Podcast. When we come back, I want to dive a little bit more into the religious beliefs of the Hasidic community.
Absolutely.
We'll be right back on the TŌV Podcast.
Thank you.
Since 1887, Life in Messiah has helped Christians understand the Jewish roots of our faith and God's ongoing commitment to His people. We teach that anti-Semitism is inconsistent with biblical faith, and we pray for the peace of Jerusalem, which includes her spiritual renewal as well as physical safety. In all we do, our priority is to share the gospel message. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, or at lifeinmessiah.org. That's lifeinmessiah.org.